3:41:22 a.m. A single missile struck USS Nitze on the port bow just below the forward waterline. The 513-kilogram warhead detonated against the hull plating and opened a 1.2-meter breach in the forward section. Seawater began entering the forward compartments within seconds. The forward fire suppression header, the main pipe feeding firefighting water to the entire bow section, severed on impact, and somewhere in the cascade that followed, the forward vertical missile tubes registered a sump flooding alarm. A second missile had already been launched from the North Korean coastal battery at Wonsan. Time of flight, 8 minutes. 9 sailors from the damage control team were about to save a $1.8 billion guided missile destroyer with a piece of softwood cut from a spare timber in the damage control locker. Cost of that timber, $6. The waters off Wonsan are not forgiving in any season. In the early morning hours of that patrol, the East Sea carried a low chop and a pre-dawn fog that cut visibility to under a kilometer. USS Nitze, an A.R. Lee Burke-class guided missile destroyer hull DDG-94, had been running a close-in coastal surveillance tasking, operating within the sensor shadow of the North Korean port at Wonsan to track coastal defense battery activity. It was the kind of mission that kept the ship nearer to the coast than doctrine preferred. The Silkworm HY-2 missile, a weapon developed in the 1960s copied from Soviet designs, was not sophisticated. It flew low, it flew slow by modern standards, and its 513-kilogram warhead was built for a different era of naval warfare. But the North Korean Coastal Defense Network still operated it in significant numbers, pre-positioned along the coastline precisely for moments like this one. At close range, against a ship occupied with surveillance rather than active defense, the HY-2 did not need to be sophisticated to cause catastrophic damage. The missile struck at 03:41:22. The chief engineer, 18 years in the engineering spaces of A.R. Lee Burke-class destroyers, 2 deployments to the Western Pacific and 1 to the 5th Fleet area, was already awake. He had been up since 3:30 reviewing a minor auxiliary pump irregularity that had appeared on the engineering control station readouts during the midwatch. He was standing at that station, the nerve center of the ship's propulsion and power systems, 2 decks below the bridge, when the detonation registered through the hull. The sound was not what most people expect from a missile strike. No thunderclap. It was a dense, low concussion that traveled through the steel like a struck bell, felt in the chest before it reached the ears. The chief engineer was moving before the first alarm sounded. The first alarm was not the flooding alarm. It was the fire main pressure drop alarm, an alert that the forward fire suppression header had lost pressure. In the first seconds after the strike, that alarm told him something specific. The bow section had no fire suppression. If anything had ignited forward, and with a 513-kilogram warhead against the hull, ignition was not a remote possibility. The DC team would be fighting it with portable extinguishers and hoses fed from secondary connections, not from the main system. The flooding alarm came 11 seconds later. The damage cascade that followed the Silkworm HY-2 strike moved through the ship's systems in a sequence the chief engineer would later describe as a compression of every training scenario he had ever run, collapsed into about 90 seconds. The hull breach, 1.2 meters wide, port bow, below the forward waterline, began admitting seawater into the anchor capstan room, the space directly above the anchor chain mechanism at the bow. That compartment was designed to be sealed, and the watertight integrity of the surrounding bulkheads would determine how fast the flooding spread. But the anchor capstan room shared a boundary with the forward passageway, and the forward passageway connected, through hatches and scuttles, to the forward section of the ship's vertical launch system. The missile tubes sitting in the forward deck, each containing a missile worth more than $1 million, the sump of the vertical launch system. The drainage basin at the base of the missile tubes was now registering water ingress. Not catastrophic flooding, not yet, but seawater finding its way through the damaged forward structure into a space never designed to see seawater. If the sump filled and that water reached the electrical components at the base of the launcher cells, the forward vertical launch system would go offline. 14 missile cells taken off the board with the second Silkworm HY-28 minutes from the ship. The chief engineer understood the Cascade within the first 45 seconds. He had the flooding report from the damage control headquarters team, the fire main pressure reading confirming the bow section had no fire suppression, and the sump alarm from the forward missile launcher. He understood what each of those facts connected to. The question was sequence. Which problem would end the ship if left unaddressed, and which could be managed long enough to deal with first things first? The flooding was primary. The forward section was taking water at a rate the damage control team estimated, based on the breach size and current sea state, at roughly 200 liters per minute. At that rate, the anchor capstan room would be knee-deep in 15 minutes. Water would find paths through the ship's structure that no diagram fully accounted for. It would reach the forward passageway. It would threaten the vertical launch system sump and trim. The angle at which the ship sat in the water would begin shifting forward as the bow took on weight. A ship down by the bow had degraded maneuverability. A ship with degraded maneuverability and a second missile inbound had a problem it might not solve. 7 minutes, 20 seconds remaining on the second missile's time of flight. The damage control team from the DC-2 locker, the forward damage control station closest to the breach, was already moving. 9 sailors in firefighting gear and self-contained breathing apparatus, the full SCBA kit with a 15-kilogram backpack breathing unit and face mask, descended through the forward passageway and into the anchor capstan room. The space they dropped into was dark. Red emergency lighting from a single battle lantern cut a cone of visibility maybe 4 meters across. The water was already at ankle depth and rising, and it was cold. The East Sea in the early morning ran at around 15 degrees Celsius, and that temperature hit through the gear like a pressure. The breach was forward and low, near the port side of the bow. Finding it in the red-lit dark was the first task, and it took 1 minute and 40 seconds. 1 minute and 40 seconds in which the water rose another 8 centimeters. When the lead damage controlman reached the breach with his helmet light, what he found was not a clean hole. The missile impact had torn the hull plating inward, creating a ragged aperture with bent steel lips that would make any seal difficult. The inflow was under pressure from the sea outside. The ship's bow cutting through the water at even reduced speed created a dynamic pressure against the hull. A soft patch, a rubber sheet pressed and wired against the hull from inside, would need to overcome that pressure. The anchor capstan room did not have a soft patch pre-staged. What it had was a damage control kit with a spare length of softwood timber, a 10 by 10 centimeter section of pine, carried in the damage control locker for exactly this category of emergency, unchanged from the DC manuals of 50 years earlier. $6, the cost of that timber in any lumber yard. The lead damage controlman assessed the breach aperture. The ragged hull opening was roughly 1.2 meters at its widest, but the inflow concentrated in a lower section, a gap perhaps 30 centimeters across where the hull plating had torn away cleanest. The rest was partially blocked by bent steel. A plug driven into that 30-centimeter gap would not stop all the flooding, but it could reduce the inflow by 60 or 70%. The margin between a bow trim the ship could counter-flood against and one that would outpace any response. The timber was in the locker. The saw was in the locker. There was no time for precision cutting. 2 sailors braced against the hull facing the incoming water. A third worked the saw. The anchor capstan room was ankle deep, then mid-calf, and the cold was not something that stayed theoretical. It moved through the gear and into the legs and made the simple act of standing on the flooded, sloped deck plates an exercise in continuous balance. The saw ran. The timber came off the spare length at a rough angle. Not a perfect fit, never going to be a perfect fit. And the team drove it into the lower section of the breech aperture with a hammer and with body weight. What struck anyone who later reviewed the recovery report was not that the plug succeeded on the first attempt. It did not. The first attempt failed. The cut angle was wrong, and the timber slipped under the pressure of the incoming water. The lead damage controlman pulled it back, hammered the edges against the surrounding steel to better profile the shape, and drove it again. The second attempt partially seated. Inflow dropped by perhaps 30%, not enough. The team added a secondary wedge, a second piece driven alongside the first, building the seal in layers. The water was at knee height by the time the seal reduced to a manageable seep. The plug held. Not perfectly, it leaked. But the catastrophic inflow pressing the bow down and threatening the missile launcher's sump dropped to a seep the portable emergency pump the team had brought with them could handle. The team's lead damage controlman had a burn on his left forearm from a fragment of heated steel scattered by the missile strike. He did not mention it during the operation. He mentioned it later to the corpsman when the forearm had stiffened enough that the range of motion on the pump handle became an issue. 5 minutes, 11 seconds remaining on the second missile's time of flight. On the bridge, the officer of the deck had called away the counter-flooding evolution, pumping water into specific aft compartments to balance the weight the bow was taking on. Counter-flooding was not a solution. It was a time-buying measure, a way to keep the ship's trim from degrading while the DC team addressed the source. With the plug in place and the inflow reduced, counter-flooding had something to work against. The bow trim, which had been pressing forward at a rate visible on the helm station's trim indicator, stabilized. Not corrected. Stabilized. The ship was still down by the bow, but it was no longer worsening at the rate that would have made maneuvering impossible. The forward vertical launch system sump had taken on water to a depth of about 4 centimeters. The watch team at the missile launcher control station had secured the sump drainage system and was monitoring the level. 4 centimeters was inside the operational limit. The forward vertical launch cells remained online. 14 missiles were still in the fight. The fire main, the fire suppression water supply to the entire bow section, was a different problem, one the chief engineer could not fully solve in 8 minutes. The forward header had been severed by missile fragmentation. With that header cut, no fire suppression water was reaching any of the forward spaces. The DC team in the anchor capstan room was operating in a space with no fixed suppression backup. If anything ignited forward, a fuel line, an electrical cable carrying residual charge, the remaining damage from the impact itself. The team's only options were portable extinguishers and a hose fed from a cross-connection point 2 compartments aft. What the chief engineer did was establish a boundary. He set the forward damage control boundary at the passageway junction just aft of the anchor capstan room. 2 damage controlmen were posted at that boundary with portable extinguishers and a hose already charged from the aft connection. Anything that ignited forward of that line would be fought from that point. It was not a comfortable option, but it created a defensible perimeter while the plug team worked the flooding, and it kept the fire suppression gap from becoming an uncontrolled exposure for the entire forward half of the ship. The chief engineer made that boundary call in approximately 4 seconds. 18 years in engineering spaces will do that. Reduce a decision with 10 variables to a sequence of 4 steps that happens before conscious deliberation finishes its first sentence. 3 minutes, 40 seconds remaining on the second missile's time of flight. The close-in weapons system, CIWS, pronounced CWIS, The ship's last-line automated defense gun is a 20mm Gatling system that uses its own independent radar to track and engage incoming missiles at close range. On USS Nitze, the CIWS was aft of the main superstructure, unaffected by the forward strike, with its own power feed from the after switchboard. It was online. It had been online since the first missile hit, and the system's autonomous tracking software had already logged the second Silkworm HY-2 contact based on radar return. There is something specific about what the CIWS does at the moment of engagement that everyone on deck within 50 meters feels before they hear anything official. The system spins up its barrel assembly to fire-ready rotation, around 3,000 revolutions per minute. And that spin creates a vibration that carries through the deck plates like a dentist's drill heard through a wall. Not loud, but present in a way that bypasses the ears and registers in the sternum. The sailors still in the anchor capstan room, still knee-deep in cold water, still managing the pump, still watching the plug for any sign of creep. Felt it. At 1,100 meters from the ship, the CIWS engaged the second Silkworm HY-2. The engagement lasted less than 3 seconds. The 20mm rounds depleted uranium penetrators at over 1,000 meters per second, crossed the distance to the inbound missile in a fraction of a second per burst. The Silkworm HY-2's guidance section came apart first, followed by the airframe, followed in the final fraction of a second by the warhead, which did not achieve full detonation. A partial detonation sent fragments across the water and across the ship's bow at low angle. Several fragments impacted the hull above the waterline. None breached the hull. None reached the forward damage control team. The second missile did not complete its engagement. In the aftermath of the CIWS firing, the ship was quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that follows a very loud thing when the hearing is still processing the sound levels and the brain is still parsing whether the threat is resolved. The officer of the deck held course. The engineering watch confirmed power status on the aft switchboard. The forward vertical launch system remained online. The plug held. In the anchor capstan room, the lead damage controlman put a hand on the timber and checked it for creep. Any outward movement would signal the seal was failing under sustained sea pressure. The timber did not move. The seep around the edges continued manageable by the portable pump. The pump was rated for this flow rate. The team had confirmed the rating before they drove the plug in the 45 seconds between getting the timber to the breach and making the first cut. That is a damage control habit. Confirm the pump can handle what the plug leaves behind before committing to the seal. Somewhere above them in the dim pre-dawn off Wonsan, the remnants of the second Silkworm HY-2 were settling into the East Sea at roughly 1,100 meters from the hull they had been aimed at. The damage control team began assessing what they would need to hold this configuration until the ship could transit to a facility for permanent repair. The answer was the pump, the plug as it stood, and someone watching both for the next several hours. The chief engineer walking the forward passageway from the engineering control station to the anchor capstan room for the first time since the strike. Through spaces still littered with fragmentation debris, past the severed fire main header spraying a reduced stream from a bypass valve a junior damage controlman had partially closed to limit the loss, assessed the damage in person and confirmed the plan. The ship could make way. Propulsion was unaffected. The bow trim had stabilized and was correcting slowly as counter-flooding redistributed weight. The forward vertical launch cells were operational. There was a paper coffee cup on the engineering control station console that had somehow, through the strike and the counter-flooding evolution and the CIWS engagement, remained upright. Half full. Cold. The chief engineer noticed it when he returned to write his first engineering casualty log entry. He left it where it was. 300 kilometers to the northwest at the Coastal Defense Battery Command Post outside Wonsan. The officer responsible for the Silkworm HY-2 battery section reviewed the engagement tracking data. The first missile's telemetry had gone dark on impact, consistent with a successful strike. The second missile's telemetry had gone dark at approximately 1,100 meters from the target. He read the radar track data twice. He set the pen down. He looked at the second missile's terminal track, the heading, the closing rate, the distance at which the return disappeared. He picked up the pen again and began revising the engagement report. He sat with the revised draft for 31 minutes before authorizing it for transmission. After that, the ship's watch settled into the particular kind of sustained readiness that follows an engagement technically concluded, but whose consequences are still physically present. The pump ran, the plug held, the forward missile cells sat loaded and online. The CIWS was reloaded from the automated magazine and sat in standby, tracking nothing. The burn on the lead damage controlman's forearm was dressed by the corpsman at approximately 0500. Second degree, approximately 12 square centimeters caused by a fragment of heated hull steel scattered at low angle during the initial breach event. The corpsman noted it would scar. The damage controlman was back at his station within the hour. One detail that does not appear in most after-action frameworks but shows up consistently in the crew statements. The anchor capstan room smelled like burnt metal and seawater for the rest of the transit. Every member of the DC-2 team who had been below that morning could identify that smell for years afterward. It is a specific combination. The iron tang of heated steel mixed with the flat mineral scent of ocean water that has entered a space it was never supposed to enter. And it does not leave quickly. 2 Silkworm HY-2 missiles launched, 1 hull breach 1.2 meters below the forward waterline, 1 fire main header severed bow section fire suppression offline, 1 vertical launch system sump compromised, 4 centimeters water ingress, 14 forward cells retained operational status. 9 damage control personnel in the flooded anchor capstan room. 1 softwood plug, hand-cut and hammer-driven, reducing inflow from 200 liters per minute to a managed seep. Counter-flooding evolution stabilized bow trim. CIWS engagement of second inbound missile at 1,100 meters. Warhead partial detonation, no hull penetration. Crew injuries, 1 second-degree burn, 1 DC team member treated for mild cold exposure, 2 sailors evaluated for concussion symptoms from the initial detonation, all returned to duty within 8 hours. U.S. assets lost, 0. Ship status operational. The wooden plug, hand cut from a spare softwood timber in the forward damage control locker, driven by hammer and body weight into a torn hull aperture in the dark in cold water with $6 of material, remained in the hull of USS Nitze for 31 days, until the ship reached depot-level repair. The maintenance crew that removed it photographed it before installing the permanent fitting. The plug was listed on the repair manifest as temporary watertight repair. Bow section port side, certified by chief engineer. The depot crew kept the photograph.